Good morning. What I wanted to speak to you today about was Gideon. And the reason for that is he's always been an interesting character to me. So I hope you like it. And if you don't, I think the best thing to do is just let Pastor Mott know how much you enjoy hearing Matt Ruma bring messages. And it should work out for everybody except for maybe one person. So, we'll see how it goes. But that's the contingency plan there. So we read about Gideon in Judges, and specifically Judges 6 through 8, if you want to flip there. And I don't want to read the whole thing, the whole story, but we're going to hit different highlights. It's kind of just wandering through his life, I guess I'd call it. But to start off with, I just wanted to give you a real high-level 3,000-foot view of the story. And basically it starts with Israel in oppression. Midian is impoverishing them. But that's because they had left what God told them to do. They weren't fulfilling His word and ended up in captivity. So then they cry to God, and He sends a deliverer. And Gideon's raised up. Then he's told to destroy an altar that was on his father's land, which he almost gets killed for. The people cry for his death. But then the Midianites come against them, and then everybody rallies behind Gideon to go fight the bad guys. But then God says they have too many people, so He ends His army thinned twice before finally going up against the Midianites. And one of the most incredible victories probably ever. But after that, they rout the Midianites, they chase them down. They stop at 2 cities asking for food, and are refused both times. Then they finally catch the kings of the Midianites and bring them back and kind of get revenge on the cities that wouldn't help them at the time. And after that, everything's successful. They try to make Gideon king. He refuses, saying that God is their king. And he then makes an ephod out of the loot they had gathered from the Midianites. And then he dies with a whole bunch of kids. So he had a total of 70 at the end, it said. So anyway, so the first part I wanted to just look at was verses 1 through 10. And the children of Israel, chapter 6, and the children, Judges 6, 1 through 10. And the children of Israel did the evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them in the hand of Midian 7 years. And the hand of Midian prevailed against Israel, and because of the Midianites, the children of Israel made them dens which are in the mountains, and caves and strongholds. And so it was, when Israel had sown, the Midianites came up, and the Amalekites and the children of the east, even they came up against them, and they encamped against them, and destroyed the increase of the earth till thou come to Gaza, and left no substance for Israel, neither sheep, nor ox, nor ass. For they came with their cattle and their tents, and they came as grasshoppers for multitude, for both they and their camels were without number, and they entered into the land to destroy it. And Israel was greatly impoverished because of the Midianites, and the children of Israel cried unto the Lord. And it came to pass, when the children of Israel cried unto the Lord because of the Midianites, the Lord sent a prophet unto the children of Israel, which said unto them, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, I brought you up from Egypt, and brought you forth out of the house of bondage, and I delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians, and out of the hand of all that oppressed you, and drove out from before you, and gave you their land. And I said unto you, I am the Lord your God, fear not the gods of the Amorites, in whose land ye dwell, but ye have not obeyed my voice. So we start off, and they're in oppression, and the first thing they do is cry to God, and He answers them. Even though this was, if you've read the book of Judges, it's sort of a cycle. They mess up, they go after idols, they get sold into the hands of their enemies, and then cry to God, and then He raises up a deliverer, and they usually live right for the rest of the days of that deliverer, and then they start over. And it's a continuous cycle, but with God's endless mercy, He hears them and raises up the deliverer. And the first thing He does is warn them. I mean, the first thing is send a prophet to tell them what they're doing wrong, and also how to get it right. And it's if they had listened here, and again, many times before this point, but if they had just listened, they would have had to learn, or they could have learned in a lot easier format, right? So too often we learn things the hard way, as Israel had here. And we read in Proverbs 17:10, a reproof entereth more into a wise man than 100 stripes into a fool. And here Israel had to learn the hard way instead of turning and not being in the situation that they currently are in. And I think it does kind of mirror our experience as well. I mean, because once we were sold under sin, and before we had the light of the truth sent through a messenger of God to tell us what we needed to fix, we also just led a worthless life that was full of vanity. But notice what the prophet says first. The first thing he does is he comes to him and he says, "Thus saith the Lord God of Israel," and he starts listing all the things that God's already done for him. And that's exactly what we find in the gospel. We find that if you believe that you are already saved and already God's already done. He acted first, I guess is my point. And so basically he reminds them of everything that God's already done for them, and that's, and then also, hey, here's what I told you not to do, and you're doing it, so get it right. Anyway, the next section, Gideon is called, and he's just threshing wheat under. So it's section verses 6. I'm sorry, chapter 6, verses 11 through 36. And what happens is an angel shows up, talks to him, and says basically that he's a man of valor. But Gideon disagrees and says, well, not disagrees, but he says, well, let's just read it. And there came an angel, verse 11, and there came an angel of the Lord, which sat under an oak which is in Ophrah, that pertained to Joash the Abiezrite. And his son Gideon threshed wheat by the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him and said unto him, The Lord is with thee, thou mighty man of valor. And Gideon said unto him, O my Lord, if the Lord be with us, why then is all this befallen us, and where be all his miracles which our fathers told us of, saying, Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt, or from Egypt? But now the Lord hath forsaken us, and delivered us into the hand of the Midianites. And the Lord looked upon him and said, Go in this thy might, that thou shalt save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have not I sent thee? And he said unto him, O my Lord, wherewith shall I save Israel? Behold, my family is poor in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house. And the Lord said unto him, Surely I will be with thee, and thou shalt smite the Midianites as one man. And he said unto him, If now I have found grace in my sight, show me a sign that thou talkest with me. And it's basically then he brings a gift to the angel, who burns it on a rock, and it proves that he's not just a man telling him this. So, first of all, they're under oppression from the Midianites, which the Midianites were descendants of Midian, who was born to Abraham and Keturah in Genesis 25, 1 and 2. And that was one of the kids he had after Isaac, and he sent him away after, all of his kids after, so that Isaac would be the only heir. And the Midianites do show up a few other places. One is when we see Joseph sold to Midianite traders in Genesis 37, and when Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh, he ran into the land of Midian. And the other enemy that we come across is the Amalekites. Those are descendants of Esau, which you can read about in Genesis 36, verse 12. And they also were enemies of Israel. So, verse 13, we read, And Gideon said unto him, O my Lord, if the Lord be with us, why then is all this befallen us? And where be his miracles which our fathers told us of? So, did the Lord forsake him? I mean, yes, he did, but at the same time, later on we see that he had a shrine on his father, or his father had a shrine to Baal and a grove on his land. So, my question is, who forsook who first? I mean, I'm assuming that's not the only one in the land of Israel, so did God forsake them, or did they forsake God? If you look over in 2 Chronicles 15:2, it says, Hear me, Asa, and all Judah and Benjamin. The Lord is with you while ye be with him. And if ye seek him, he will be found of you. But if ye forsake him, he will forsake you. And that's, Gideon doesn't seem to realize that that's exactly what happened. They were the ones who departed from God, and the prophet in the beginning warned them of that very thing. So we also see Gideon. He's there. He's threshing wheat by the winepress, and they know that they're very impoverished at this point because the Midianites have been taking everything they had. And I think it's interesting because it kind of mirrors how the apostles were called, or some of them anyway, right? So some of the apostles were fishing when they were called and made to become fishers of men. So Gideon is threshing and made to become a thresher of men, specifically Midianites. And then later, the cities that refused them help with the work. And also, I think it's interesting that just like a lot of the other callings in the Bible, he was busy working when he got the call. Like, for instance, in Matthew 9:9, we read about Matthew, who was sitting at receipt of custom, working when God said, hey, come with me. And then in Matthew 4:18, Simon and Peter Simon called Peter and Andrew, his brother. I mean, they were both working when they got the call. So I just think it's interesting that the people that God chooses to use are most often just involved with their daily work when God has a special cause for them. So he's hiding it by the winepress. I think that's interesting because why would that be a good spot for hiding? Yeah, you wouldn't initially think to look for wheat there, but it's probable that when they had so little food left, the Midianites had quit looking there. I mean, they're not making wine if they're hurting for food. So, I don't know. It's just, it seems like a reasonable hiding spot. So later, Gideon gets the call, or the angel shows up, and he objects, right? He objects and says, wait a minute, I'm the youngest son of a poor family. And again, not probably the least likely to be chosen from a human standpoint, but that's just how we see God working over and over again. David was the least in his father's house and chosen to be king of Israel. 1 Corinthians 1:26 and 29, we read, for you see your calling, brethren, how that not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called, but God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. And God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty, and the base things of the world, and the things which are despised. Hath God chosen, yea, and the things which are not, to bring to naught the things that are, that no flesh should glory in his presence. So later on, he tells him he's going to go save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. And he says, go in this, in verse 14, he says, go in this thy might, and thou shalt save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. But what might is that? Well, he says right after, have not I sent thee? And that is the might that he's got. When you're doing the work of God, and he has his word behind what you're doing, then you are acting with might, because God takes his word very seriously, and if he told you to do something, he's going to make it possible. So Gideon says, wherewith shall I save Israel? And it's not hard to understand why he would wonder, because he says he's the least in his father's house, so either he seemed to lack credibility with his father's house, or at least numbers. So what are you supposed to do? I mean, people tend, at least secular people, and I would say that Israel at this point is pretty carnal, and they're going to look for people who have power or money or the great ones for leadership, and Gideon lacked both. And God has an answer for all these problems. And what he says in verse 16 is, surely I will be with thee, and thou shalt smite the Midianites as one man. So it doesn't matter what else you don't have, it's just what you do have. If God is with you, it doesn't matter how many or what or anything else. So, and it's not uncommon. I mean, we also see like the apostles, when they were told to feed the multitude, they looked around and said, hey, we don't have the stuff to feed all these people. And I mean, so it just, here's Gideon, a man of, he's listed in Hebrews 11 as a great hero of faith, and the first thing he's doing is looking around and saying, well, wait, we don't have this, what am I going to do? How am I going to do this? So anyway, that God doesn't really need a lot of resources was recognized by Jonathan in 1 Samuel 14 when he said, there is no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few. So that to me is interesting because it seems like Jonathan had more faith than Gideon. But if you notice, as we go through this, we'll see Gideon over and over again asking for proof or for something to strengthen his faith until eventually he uses that faith that he's got to overcome insurmountable odds. And again, it specifically says that God delivered him into his hands. But it's interesting. So we also see that he's a little reluctant to undertake, again, because he's not anybody of great importance in the nation. But we see that over and over again. First of all, the unwillingness of Moses to go when called. In Exodus 3:11, it says, and Moses said unto God, who am I that I should go unto Pharaoh, and that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt? Why me? And again in 4:10, Exodus 4:10, and Moses said unto the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither heretofore, nor since thou hast spoken unto thy servant, but of slow speech and a slow tongue. So again, God picks things that aren't necessarily the most powerful and the most naturally potent, and then makes them so. Jeremiah was also reluctant to go when called. In Jeremiah 1:6, he says, and then said I, Lord God, behold, I cannot speak, for I am a child. And we also see Amos say in 7:14, Amos 7:14, then answered Amos and said unto Amaziah, I was no prophet, neither was I a prophet's son, but I was a herdsman and a gatherer of sycamore fruit. And the Lord took me as I followed the flock, and the Lord said unto me, go prophesy unto my people Israel. So Gideon wasn't really doing anything all that important, and then gets the call and is a little reluctant to go, but does when told. But again, God doesn't need resources to act, so we don't have to worry about what you have or don't have in order to do something that God told you to do. So then he starts off getting asked for a sign to say, show me that that thou talkest with me, in verse 17. So he wants proof immediately of that this is for real. And so it's just, again, you kind of question, this is a hero of faith. And Hebrews 11, he's asking about all these evidences to show that it's for real. But he does. And I notice also, so again, remember that they're hurting for sustenance at this point. Midian's got them pretty much, they're impoverished, right? And so what he does is he brings a gift of food, even though at that point it was probably pretty rare. And I think it's interesting that, he knows that it's the angel of God, or at least he does later, but he brings a gift out, even though the food might be hard to come by. Which to me just says that even when resources are scarce, still make sure to continue giving however you can and whenever you can. So right after this, he builds an altar and he calls it Jehovah is Peace, and verse 24. Which kind of sums up what happens. It's a bit of a foreshadowing of after the events are past of the next chapter or so, when Gideon it does deliver the land of Israel and they have peace. So he looks right past the coming battles and all the struggles that are down the road to the inevitable victory at the end that God has called him to. He said he's going to overcome the Midianites and deliver them, and instead of focusing on the battle in front of him, he remembers that it's got a happy ending. God is peace. And think that's a good way to handle our own struggles, remembering no matter what we're going through, at the end of the day, at the end of this life, we have an inevitable victory waiting for us as well. And Jehovah is peace. So verses 24 through 35, he builds the altar, and that same night the Lord said unto him, Take thy father's young bullock, even the second bullock of 7 years old, and throw down the altar of Baal that thy father hath, and cut down the grove that is by it. Again, his father had a grove to Baal on his land. And build an altar unto the Lord thy God at the top of this rock in the ordered place, and take the second bullock and offer a burnt sacrifice with wood of the grove which thou shalt cut down. And Gideon took 10 men of his servants, and did as the Lord had said unto him. And so it was, because he feared his father's household and the men of the city, that he could not do it by day, that he did it by night. And when the men of the city arose in the morning, behold, the altar of Baal was cast down, and the grove was cut down that was by it, and the second bullock was offered upon the altar that was built. And they said one to another, Who hath done this thing? And when they inquired and asked, they said, Gideon, the son of Joash, hath done this thing. And the men of the city said to Joash, Bring out thy son, that he may die, because he hath cut down the altar of Baal, and because he hath cut down the grove that was by it. And Joash said to all that stood against him, Will ye plead for Baal? Will ye save him, that he... will ye save him? He that will plead for him, let him be put to death while it is yet morning. If he be a god, let him plead for himself, because one hath cast down his altar. Therefore on that day he called him Jerubbaal, saying, Let Baal plead against him, because he hath thrown down his altar. I think it's interesting that here is Gideon, and it's not exactly the stereotypical view of Christianity that you get when he's called, right? His first act isn't to accept any type of worship, and remember that all roads lead to God, and it's just, you worship whatever works for you, I'll worship however, but we're all worshiping the same God. No, he's actually called to work against false gods. I mean, like you said, I've heard people say that it doesn't matter which deity you worship because it's all part of the same God. Doesn't seem to be the case, at least not here. It's not the case. But it's just not what you'd expect, right? I mean, not what I guess most people would expect. He's immediately set to clean up his father's house and his land. And also notice that he's doing exactly what God told him, and it immediately gets him in trouble, while doing almost anything else wouldn't have, right? He could do pretty much anything under the guise of Baal worship, and it would have been fine. But you work against that, doing what God told you to do, and it's going to immediately be a problem. It just seems to be the way it goes. I mean, Jesus promised that there would be trouble if you follow him, and again, that wasn't written just yet, but it seems to be true all the way back through the whole book. So, when it comes to this sacrifice, a couple interesting things about it. He's told to offer the second bullock. And I started wondering, well, the second bullock, what happened to the first one? And we don't really know, but based on what it sounds like, some speculations say that it was either blemished or infirmed and wouldn't have been suitable for a sacrifice. And I thought one other explanation was particularly intriguing, and that was the second one may have been intended for use in that particular altar or grove that they had for Baal, and it was intended to be a sacrifice for Baal, and instead gets commandeered and used by Gideon for God. And if it had been fattened for years as preparation for a worship service to Baal, that you can understand why people will be so upset, right? If you spent 7 years feeding a bullock, and now you also, while you're being impoverished, because remember from the beginning of chapter 6, they had been sold into the hand of Midian for years at this point. I think it says how many. Yeah, 7 years, which is exactly how old that bullock is. So maybe that's coincidence, probably not though. So then if you spent all the money feeding and fatting this calf or bullock to sacrifice to Baal, and then it gets taken and used by Gideon, you can understand they would be pretty upset. So I was wondering, a lot of pagan roots are found in modern Christianity, and I was questioning if maybe this was the Baal Christmas party that he ruined. And that kind of makes sense too, because again, if you've ever spoken out against Christmas, you've found that people are pretty ready to, call for your death right after. So, I don't know. Maybe not, but... And then this is interesting too. Like, God finally hears him, or not finally hears him, he hears him, right? And he's raising up a deliverer. And the first thing the deliverer does is to clean up the city. And what happens? The people that he's working for try to kill him. And it's just funny. I don't know, to me anyway. And it would have been fine. Like, if he had just gone along with the heir of his family and his country and the culture, he would have been fine. He would have escaped the pain of, or that difficulty, right? But he has a choice. He can either face that pain, or he can face the pain of not doing what God told him to do down the road. And you notice there's a price in either case, but it's certainly better to pay the price now and do what God told you to do than later. But people are really unwilling to pay the price now. I have an old boss. And we would always joke about Christmas and how so much of it is derived from paganism. And he'd laugh and agree. And then he's like, I'm like, so do you have wreaths and trees in your house? He's like, oh yeah. I'm like, well, why? He's like, oh, my wife likes it. And he's like, he agrees that it's from paganism and that it's not right, but his wife likes it, so he's not willing to pay the price and go through the difficulties of doing the right thing because it's too much trouble. But I argue that it's not a choice of pay the price or don't pay the price. It's pay one price or the other, and it's certainly better to pay it, now. So Gideon does this, and he does it. You notice it's interesting. He's afraid, but he does it anyway. He feared his father's household in verse 27, and the men of the city. But he doesn't not do it. He just finds a way to do it where it's possible. And it's still that God didn't specifically say do it during the day. He still followed all the things God told him to do, despite being afraid, and did the right thing. I thought John Gill pointed out a few things that are unusual about this offering, though. He pointed out Gideon was not a priest, and yet bid to offer sacrifice. Normally that wasn't just for anybody to go do. And he did that on an altar of his own erecting, not the altar of God. And on top of this rock, where he built this altar, and not at the tabernacle. And he used wood of a grove or idol, which in other cases wouldn't be allowed. And he did it at night, which was not the time of sacrificing. But again, that's not set up as an ordinance, but a special action for a special case. So in this case, to do anything else would have been wrong. And judgment begins at home. The first thing he cleans up is his father's house. And we know that that's not far off from the New Testament, where we read in 1 Peter 4:17 that judgment must begin at the house of God. The Old Testament priests had to be clean and separate from the people before they started offering. And we should always make sure to clean and separate ourselves from the world before we come to serve God, most especially His table. And 2 Corinthians 6:17, we read, "Come out and be separate. Touch not the unclean, and I will receive you." In our example, Gideon had to publicly separate with the traditions of his family, his house, his nation. They were wrong, but separation from tradition is very difficult. I'm sure many people have experienced that, but it can cause a lot of chaos even when it's just brands of the same thing, like different versions of Christianity. I've kind of seen that one myself, but I think there are quite a number of people that prefer tradition to truth. And I imagine you can find, or probably just recall, people who might be here with us today if they were willing to choose the truth over their family or over tradition or over whatever else, the cares of the world. Or people who never joined with us because of that. But as Gideon, he didn't ask his family how they felt about it. They didn't get a vote on what he did when it came to what God told him to do. And you notice he doesn't start by tearing down all of the altar Baals, which I'm assuming are altars to Baal and groves throughout the entire nation. He just starts with his house. And that's where we should start too. I mean, we can't clean up the entire planet, but we can clean up our houses and keep those free from anything that would offend God. And when I was looking into this, I thought it was interesting that paganism really started at the beginning of Israel. Even when Jacob was leaving Laban after serving with him and collecting his wives, Rachel stole his images, Laban's images, right? So from the very beginning, before they even had all 12 of the tribes, there was, the idols were there. So it's when you see it throughout, it kind of makes sense because it's a constant thorn in their side, and it started way back at the very beginning. So anyway, there's a public outcry for Gideon's death after he finishes this. And it's interesting, these are Jews, right? And instead of demanding that he be judged under the Jewish law, they just say, no, bring him out and kill him. Which you wouldn't expect. But when you think about it, could it be that they didn't like the law of Moses too much at this time because they were afraid they might find other things in there that wouldn't, coincide well with their current lifestyle? So instead of that, they just decided, we'll be judge, jury, and executioner. We're just going to kill him because he did it. And I really like what his dad, Joash, has to say here. And Joash, in verse 31, said unto all that stood against him, will ye plead for Baal? Will ye save him? He that will plead for him, let him be put to death while it is yet morning. If he be a god, let him plead for himself, because one hath cast down his altar. So Joash was involved in all this stuff, but he clearly didn't really believe it too much, because he's willing to defend his son against the entire town. And if so it certainly seems that though he was participating in it, he might have just been doing it because it was fun or who knows what, but he really didn't seem to have a lot of faith in Baal's ability to do anything. And it reminded me of another of my favorite contests between true and false gods, when Elijah goes up against the prophets of Baal in 1 Kings 18:26. And there's going to be a competition to see who's the true God. And so there's 450 prophets of Baal on one side and Elijah on the other. And they're going to say, okay, we're going to dress an offering, and whichever side gets God to call down fire and burn up the offering, that's the real God. And so in verse 26, 1 Kings 18:26, it says, speaking of the prophets of Baal, and they took the bullock that was given them, and they dressed it, and called on the name of Baal from morning even until noon, saying, O Baal, hear us. But there was no voice, nor any that answered, and they leaped on the altar that was made. And it came to pass at noon that Elijah mocked them and said, Cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is talking, or he is pursuing, or he is in a journey, or peradventure he sleepeth and must be awaked. And they cried aloud, and cut themselves after their manner with knives and lancets, till the blood gushed out upon them. So again, paganism is not good for anybody. Right there, don't do it. Anyway. But they try it. They're like, he's making fun of them. And they give it a try, and it doesn't work, and they end up dead for their mistakes. But so what can we learn on that? Idols. Well, they're described in Psalm 115, verses 4 through 8. And this is what these Baal images were. For their idols are silver and gold, the work of men's hands. They have mouths, but they speak not. Eyes have they, but they see not. They have ears, but they hear not. Noses have they, but they smell not. They have hands, But they handle not, feet have they, but they walk not, neither speak they through their throat. They that make them are like unto them, so is everyone that trusteth in them. I think it's a bit funny that anybody could actually believe that a statue is a god, but people are really that superstitious in some cases. I know people who have shrines in their houses to keep them from evil, or shrines in their cars to keep them from accidents, or, such like. Good luck charms. And they actually think it's profitable. And we can find a time in Israel where they thought the same thing. In Jeremiah 44:17, it says, Jeremiah 44:17, but we will certainly do whatsoever thing goeth forth out of our mouth, to burn incense unto the Queen of Heaven, to pour out drink offerings unto her, as we have done, and our fathers, and our kings, and our princes, in the cities of Judah, in the streets of Jerusalem, for then we had plenty of victuals, and were well, and saw no evil. But remember, in Gideon's case, early on, the reason that they're in this situation, the prophet that God sent to them told them that, hey, no, that's because you've forsaken me, and that's true. So they're looking at it and falsely assuming that because they stopped serving the Queen of Heaven, they're now suffering and have no food. But it's actually the opposite. Because they served the Queen of Heaven, they had no food. And it's not really news, but God takes this pretty seriously. He expects to be in the first position all the time. Mark 12:30, it says, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy mind, and with all thy strength. This is the first commandment. So right off the bat, and it's everything. So it's a big deal, even if it doesn't seem like much. Okay, it's just a piece of wood that somebody set up and it doesn't really matter. Yeah, it does matter. I think the bigger risk, though, at least today, there aren't too many people. There are Wiccans and pagans and people who actually do witchcraft type things and have idols and whatnot. But I think a bigger challenge is setting up idols in your heart. Or harder, not challenge to avoid, I guess. Ezekiel 14:6 says, therefore say unto the house of Israel, thus saith the Lord God, repent and turn yourselves from idols, and turn away your faces from all your abominations. For every one of the house of Israel, or the stranger that sojourneth in Israel, which separateth himself from me, and setteth up his idols in his heart, and putteth the stumbling block of his iniquity before his face, and cometh to a prophet to inquire of him concerning me, I, the Lord, will answer him by myself, and I will set my face against that man, and make him a sign and a proverb, and will cut him off in the midst of my people, and ye shall know that I am the Lord. So idolatry, it's a big deal, and they, again, were messed up in it, had been forever, and like I said, it's throughout the book of Judges, we see just a cycle. So after they call for his death, the Midianites come up, and he blows a trumpet, and everybody rallies behind him, which is interesting because they were literally just calling for his death. But now they're willing to, now there's a bigger, more pressing threat, okay, well, we'll follow you. And so Gideon is thinking about the Midianites. I don't know if he knows how many of them there are. We find out later in chapter 8 how many of them there are. But he sends messengers and gathers an army, and then asks for confirmation again that God was serious when he told him to go save Israel from the Midianites, which we read about in 33 through the end of the chapter, verse 40. I'm going to start at 36 because that's where he asks for confirmation. And Gideon said unto God, if thou wilt save Israel by my hand, as thou hast said, behold, I will put a fleece of wool in the floor, and if the dew be on the fleece only, and it be dry on the earth beside, then shall I know that thou wilt save Israel by my hand, as thou hast said. Again, he says, as thou said. He knows what he said, he just wants to make sure he meant it. And it was so, for he rose up early in the morrow, or on the morrow, and thrust the fleece together, and wringed out the dew of the fleece, a bowl full of water. But then he kind of worries that maybe that was the natural course of events, so he wants it reversed. And Gideon said unto God, let not thine anger be hot against me, and I will speak but this once. Let me prove, I pray thee, but this once with the fleece. Let it now be dry on the fleece, dry only on the fleece, upon the fleece, and upon all the ground let there be dew. So God did so that night, for it was dry on the fleece only, and there was dew on all the ground. So, this particular instance has always been a bit of a puzzle to me, because, like, what is this going to prove? But I started reading commentaries about it, and I thought there were a few that really made a lot of sense. So, Matthew Henry said, "These signs are truly miraculous and very significant. Gideon and his men were going to fight the Midianites. Could God distinguish between a small fleece of Israel and the vast floor of Midian?" Which he does in this case, right? He can tell where it is in order to have it have dew, or the reverse. John Gill said, "The dew is a sign of divine favor and would show Gideon that God is able to direct it to land on whomsoever he will. Gideon would receive grace, while all around it would be dry." So God shows he has the power to be able to bless or curse, and also to distinguish between the small things in our eyes. Like, we can tell the difference between something laying on the floor, but God not only can tell, but can control where he sends his blessings. And I think it's really interesting that Gideon asked for 2 more proofs that God actually talked to him, when he already gave him 1 when he first talked to him. And God doesn't get mad at him. He does both things, both of his requests, and it just is another proof of how God leads his children along as a father. He doesn't reprimand him. He cares about him and helps him from where he is with his understanding at that point. John Darby said, "God gives another proof of his great condescension by granting a sign to strengthen the weak but real and sincere faith of Gideon, who feels, while repeating his request, that God might well chasten him for his lack of faith. Nevertheless, the Lord grants his petition." So again, like a father or a shepherd, he's helping him from where he is and with the amount of faith he's got. Which I think is interesting, because, like, again, he does make it into chapter 11 of Hebrews as a bastion of faith, as a hero of faith, and here he is asking for all these proofs. I mean, granted, he's about to go into battle, and you want to be sure, but still. So then chapter 7, we read about him with his army, and it is too big, God says, so he thins it 2 times, and then they go up to battle. They win, and then chapter 8, we have him doing the mop-up operations from that. Okay. So let's just say, start in verse 2 of chapter 7. "And the Lord said unto Gideon, The people that are with thee are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel vaunt themselves against me, saying, Mine own hand hath saved me. Now therefore go to proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, Whosoever is fearful and afraid, let him return and depart early from Mount Gilead. And there returned of the people 22,000, and there remained 10,000. So if you're one of those 10,000, I mean, they weren't afraid, but that's got to feel bad, right? You've got 30,000 guys, and now you're down to 10,000 guys, and the enemy is still just as many as they were. But they again, these were the guys who decided to stay, so they were obviously a bit more hardy than the people who ran. Let's get this part 2. So, verse 4, "And the Lord said unto Gideon, The people are yet too many. Bring them down into the water, and I will try them for thee there. And it shall be that whom I say unto thee, This shall go with thee, the same shall go with thee. And of whomsoever I say unto thee, This shall not go with thee, the same shall not go." So God makes it very plain. No question about what he wants out of this. "So he brought down the people to the water, and the Lord said unto Gideon, Every one that lappeth of the water with his tongue as a dog lappeth, the same him shalt thou set by himself, likewise everyone that boweth down upon his knees to drink. And the number of them that lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, were 300 men, and the rest of the people bowed down on their knees to drink water. And the Lord said, by the 300 men that lapped will I save you, and deliver the Midianites into thine hand, and let all the other people go, every man to his place. So first, the fearful leave, which, I mean, think about this. From a human perspective, you're about to follow a farmer into battle, and we find out in chapter 8 that there's 135,000 Midianites, and they've got 32,000 at this point in time. So you're going to go into battle outnumbered, following a farmer 4-1. So, I mean, you could understand why some of these guys would be scared. And the other thing I was wondering is, did anybody actually see God talking to Gideon? Like, these guys that are following him, did they know? Or was it just, okay, this farmer came up to me and said, God told me to go fight these guys, so you want to come? I don't know. I don't know. Because, I mean, that just sounds a little fishy, but some of them weren't having it, and they left. But the rest of them, they're going to go through with it. So that to me is pretty strong faith. Gideon knows what he saw, but I don't know if the rest of them did. I mean, either way. But the other thing is, with paganism so rampant through Israel, down in their hearts, I mean, some of these guys probably knew what they were doing was wrong. And if now you're going into battle and you're likely, I mean, looking at the odds, you're likely going to die. Are you ready to die with all these things you've just done? Or, I mean, are you ready to meet your Maker after you've got groves in your land? You've got, idols in your house? Maybe that's why they left. I don't know, but it's possible. So then so the fearful leave, and then we've got these 10,000 which get thinned out to 300. And F.B. Mayer said, the 300 who caught up water into the hollow of their hands showed they could not forget the foe. These are men that God can use. And so we've got, all but the 300 who bowed down on their knees, which some surmise that might be because they were accustomed to bowing down on their knees, maybe at these temples or shrines of Baal, which I don't know, maybe. But if that's true, I mean, that might be why they were cut and not people God chose to use. But we don't know. But either way, we do know that the guys who brought their hand to their mouth were still able to see. They were looking up. They had their head where it was useful. They could gather intel. What I would call it was they were circumspect, which means literally looking about on all sides, looking round, hence cautious, prudent, watchful on all sides, etc., etc. And in Ephesians 5:15 it says, see that ye walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise. So, again, these 300 God could use were 300 that were circumspect. And why does that matter? It matters because just like these guys who are going off into a literal battle, our lives are a literal battle. Maybe not with swords, but in the spiritual sense, there's not really a time where you can just take Christianity and put up your feet and just coast it out. Because we have an adversary, which we read about in 1 Peter 5:8, that says, be sober, be vigilant, which again you can't do if you're on your knees with your face to the ground, because your adversary the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about seeking whom he may devour. So these guys were circumspect, and they had their head up looking around and, taking in what's going on. And that's important for a lot of things. One in particular, if you've ever played any sports, I mean, you can't tell what's going on with your head down. You have to be looking up. Same thing holds true in Christianity. I mean, there's always new pitfalls or issues that you might not be aware of. But, I mean, Pastor, again, warning us about cell phones or about things we might not have thought about should be encouragement to us to be more circumspect and to consider things that maybe we didn't think of as a problem, but could certainly develop into one. So even when taking time to recharge, to take on food and water, we must still remain vigilant if we want God to be able to use us. So these 300 guys, I mean, I still can't imagine. You've got you and 299 guys are set apart, and now it's just you from the 32,000 that you thought were going up against these enemies. And these guys weren't cowards. I mean, they didn't leave when they had the chance, but the scenario is a bit different now. So I'm not sure how bold these guys are, but it's incredible that they still were following Gideon, following the man of God, no matter what the cost. But we know that God said He would be the one working the deliverance. So if they believe that, then they're in good shape. And I think it's interesting that the reason that they didn't go forward with a greater force was to stop the pride of Israel. And again, we're warned about thinking more highly of ourselves than we ought in Romans 12:3. For I say, though the grace given to me to every man that is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, according as God hath dealt to every man the measure of faith. And pride's a constant problem that plagues all of us. I mean, it brought down the greatest created being ever, Satan. And if it's a problem for the top of the pack, I mean, it's definitely a problem for lower creatures who, again, have a bent to fallen lower creatures who are very often prideful. So anyway, then they're going to go down to battle in verse 10. It says, but if thou fear to go down, go with... So Gideon's about to go, and God talks to him and says, it came to pass that night, let me get verse 9, that the Lord said unto him, arise and get thee down to the host, for I have delivered it into thine hand. But if thou fear to go down, go thou with Purah thy servant down to the host. And thou shalt hear what they say, and afterward shall thine hand be strengthened to go down to the host. So again, it's a pretty terrifying thing to go against that many, but God is right there with them, right where He is, with his doubts. He says, if you're afraid, He makes provision for that, but He's still got to do it. So fear or no fear, He's got to get down and get to work. And fear can cause a lot of problems. It hurts faith. Just real quickly, the servant who feared and did nothing in Matthew 25:25, it says, and I was afraid and went and hid my talent in the earth, and lo, here thou hast that is thine. So it can invite judgment. It can hinder us from doing the right thing. Fear can cause you to miss out on good things. Peter, who followed afar off, which again, it doesn't specify in the verse he was afraid, but why else would he have not been that near? In Luke 22:54, they took him and led him and brought him into the high priest's house, and Peter followed afar off. And Saul, who feared the people and disobeyed in 1 Samuel 15:24, and Saul said unto Samuel, I have sinned, for I had transgressed the commandment of the Lord and thy words, because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. And these fearful are noted in Revelation as being those that are cast out. Revelation 21:8 says, but the fearful and unbelieving and the abominable and murderers and whoremongers and sorcerers and idolaters and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. So fear is a problem, but not an insurmountable one, because Gideon does fear. God helps him through it, and he goes on to take care of business. I think it's interesting, those guys who left really did miss out on something spectacular, because, like I said, who can think of another battle where 300 men overcame a force of 135,000? Like, it's unheard of, and to be part of that must have been quite something. So anyway, he goes down to the host, and he hears, let's see, where is that? Oh, there it is, verse 13. And when Gideon was come chapter 7, Judges 7:13. And when Gideon was come, behold, there was a man that told a dream to his fellow and said, Behold, I dreamed a dream, and lo, a cake of barley bread tumbled into the host of Midian, and came unto a tent, and smote it, that it fell, and overturned it, and the tent lay along. And his fellow answered, I mean, there's clearly only one possible interpretation for that dream, and his buddies got it right here. And his fellow answered and said, This is nothing else, save the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel, for into his hand the man of God delivered Midian and all the host. Okay. So Gideon hears it, and the telling of the dream, and the interpretation thereof, and he worshipped and returned, and into the host of Israel, and said, Arise, for the Lord hath delivered into your hand the host of Midian. So here's this dream of barley bread knocking down a tent, and it's not something you would normally think would happen, right? A loaf of bread knocking over a military-grade tent, it's just unlikely. But through the hand of God, God can turn that loaf into a wrecking ball, and does. And I think it's interesting that he's already causing his opponents to be afraid, and he's affecting the minds of his enemies. I also think it's amazing that they thought, oh, that's got to be Gideon. When you hear a dream like that, oh, that's definitely him. But why are they still there then? Like, why, if you know that you're doomed, they said he's going to deliver Midian into his hand, that they're still standing around waiting for, why not, go AWOL if you're a Midianite in that case? But they don't. They stay there and fight it out, or sort of. But notice this. This is what happens. Gideon gets the good news, right, in verse 15. And what's the first thing he does? And it was so, when Gideon heard the telling of the dream and the interpretation thereof, that he worshipped. And it's just, when you get good news, and when God does something great for you, that should be one of your first responses. Thank God, worship God, and Gideon is a good example of how to do that. Worship means to show reverence and adoration, the feeling or expression of reverence and adoration for a deity. So make sure to take the time to worship God for the good things that He does for you. So then Gideon's encouraged, and they get ready for the attack. So he takes his 300 men, he gives everybody a pitcher, a lamp, and a trumpet. And I was trying to find out how much, back in this day, how many trumpets you would normally have in an army, like the ratio of soldiers to trumpeters. Because typically you'd use a trumpet for calling an attack or retreat or whatever, ordering soldiers. But I wasn't able to find out. But if you assume that it was about 1,000, if you've got 300 trumpets, then you've got 300,000, you would think, 300,000 soldiers to accompany those trumpeters. And so when he goes up and scares away the Midianites, they would naturally assume that they were outnumbered more than 2 to 1, when in reality they were outnumbering their opponents 450 to 1. So the approach is really brilliant. So basically he goes up, well, let's just read it. So he breaks them into 3 companies. So he tells them to do what they do. Okay, verse 18. When I blow with the trumpet, I and all they that are I and all that are with me, then blow ye the trumpets also on every side of the camp, and say, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. So Gideon and the 100 men that were with him came to the outside of the camp in the beginning of the middle of the watch. And they had but newly set the watch, and they blew the trumpets and brake the pitchers that were in their hands. And the 3 companies blew the trumpets and brake the pitchers, and held the lamps in their left hands and the trumpets in their right hands to blow withal. And they cried, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. And they stood, every man in his place, round about the camp, and all the host ran and cried and fled. And the 300 blew the trumpets, and the Lord set every man's sword against his fellow, even throughout all the host, And the host fled to Beth-shittah and Zerath, and to the border of Abel-Meholah unto Tabbath. And then after that, they mop them up. But look at how this approach works. So the first thing he does is he comes up with 300 men, but has an exorbitant amount of trumpeters to soldier ratio. So he leads them to infer bad information. They would assume naturally that he's got soldiers per trumpet and that they have a much larger force than he actually has. And then he denies them time to react, prepare, gather their thoughts, or even calm down. So they're denied information. They're likely to infer bad information, and then he attacks their minds with fear-inducing sounds out of the darkness, lights from the darkness, and approach on 3 sides, and not 4, because that way they can still run away without running over any of his men. Because if they found out that there were so few of them, it might change the entire direction of the battle. And his psychological attack was so potent that his enemies began doing his work for him. Without even contemplating it, they're helping Gideon destroy the Midianites themselves. Because it says the Lord set every man's sword against his fellow. So they're running away and stabbing each other on the way out. So a practical lesson, I know Pastor really likes to put in practical lessons, so I thought I would put in one as well. And I think it's pretty obvious. The lesson here is don't run with sharp objects, especially through the woods at night, and most especially with another 135,000 people with sharp objects. As it turns out, 120,000 Midianites died from doing that, so I would not advise it. But what's really amazing about this is how it parallels something else. So think about this and see if it reminds you of anything. So we've got a shout, we've got a trumpet, we've got brightness suddenly appearing, and then, kind of a giveaway, we have the forces of God descending on the enemy, and all this coming as a thief in the night. And we have then after the enemies of God fleeing in terror. Does that sound like anything? It sounds like the day of the Lord, when the Lord will destroy his enemies, as foreshadowed by Gideon. So just a couple verses on that. 1 Peter 3:10, it says, 2 Peter 3:10, it says, "But the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens shall pass away with great noise." And then 1 Thessalonians, so there we've got thief in the night. 1 Thessalonians 4:16 and 17 says, "The Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trump of God." And so there we've got a shout, shout and trumpets, which again, we have both of those, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon, and then the trumpets. And then 2 Thessalonians 2:8, "And then shall that wicked be revealed, whom the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming." So we've got coming on as a thief in the night, trumpets, voices, loud voices, and then brightness. So that's very, very interesting. Just to me, it sounds exactly like the day of the Lord. And if you notice, in verse 21, notice what the soldiers are doing after they cry, right? "And they stood, every man in his place, round about the camp, and the host ran." So they didn't even do anything. God was the one working the victory, just like he will be at that last day. They're just standing around watching. And what happens to the bad guys? Revelation 6:15. We can read about the terror that they'll experience at the end of time. And it says, "And the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the rich men, hid themselves in the dens and rocks of the mountains, and said, Fall on us, and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For that great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand?" So he came on the Midianites as a thief in the night, and then it's all over. There's no time for making peace or making any other changes. It stops right there, and they're destroyed. So I think it's on tactics. I did want to read 2 quotes that I thought were really, really interesting. One, to fight and conquer in all our battles is not supreme excellence. Supreme excellence consists of breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. Sun Tzu. They didn't even go, they went from prep to mop-up. There wasn't a traditional battle in the sense of that you would normally think of it, where the 2 sides line up and charge. And John Steinbeck, who he's author of The Grapes of Wrath, he won a Nobel Prize in Literature, and he said it pretty well, and I think it kind of sums up Gideon's approach. If you find yourself in a fair fight, your tactics suck. So even with Gideon's full force at 32,000 guys, they weren't going to win a fair fight, outnumbered 4.5 to 1. I mean, it was unlikely, right? With outnumbered as badly as they were when they actually fought, it was not going to happen. So you might say, sneaking up on the enemy with trumpets in the night was a sound decision. Sorry, Danny actually dared me to say that. You can ask about it, it's true. Oh, one other thing. So at this battle, Matthew Henry said this, but it's really interesting. So what we see here is this light coming out of earthen vessels. He's got these lamps, and he breaks the earthen vessel, and then you could see the light, which kind of sounds like the gospel. God's ministers bring His glorious gospel to this world through the light. Let me try again. God's ministers bring His gospel to the world through earthen vessels, and that's how we have this treasure. And 2 Corinthians 4:3, but if our gospel be hid, it is hid to them that are lost, in whom the God of this world hath blinded the minds of them which believe not, lest the glorious gospel of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine unto them. For we preach not ourselves, but Christ Jesus the Lord, and ourselves your servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who commanded the light to shine out of darkness, hath shined in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. But we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the excellency of the power may be of God and not of us. So the glorious light of the gospel through earthen vessels. And so here's Gideon, and the light that he produces from his walk, it scares away evildoers because they hate the light, but it helps his fellow soldier walk in the light. So his light wasn't hid under a bushel. It could be seen. It had an effect. It encouraged his fellow soldier, and it dispelled darkness. And again, our light should so shine, not that people flee in terror necessarily, but so that they can see God's light shining through our earthen vessel. And all that said, I definitely don't want to give Gideon too much credit, because God said he was going to win this battle, and it was all of him from the beginning. If you notice, Gideon and his troops didn't even fight. God won it from start to finish. So, after that, the men of Ephraim get mad at him early in chapter 8. And the men of Ephraim said, Why hast thou served us thus, that thou called us not when thou wentst to fight with the Midianites? And they did chide with him sharply. So after the battle's won, they're upset that they didn't get a piece of the glory. And he said unto them, What have I done now in comparison with you? Is not okay. So I skipped a part. Sorry. There's a mop-up operation where they chase down the Midianites, and they kill Oreb and Zeb. And more of the men. And so back to verse 2. What have I done now in comparison of you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? So he's saying that their work of cleaning up was more important than his victory. And I think it's really interesting, because here he's a great leader of men, but he's also in control of his spirit, because these guys are picking a fight with him, more or less. In verse 3, God hath delivered into your hands the princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeb, and what was I able to do in comparison of you? Then their anger was abated toward him when he had said that. And then we keep going on. But you notice they're upset because he didn't call them to fight when they could have at any time gone up and fought without him and had all the glory to themselves. They didn't do that. They waited till he won. Then they get mad at him when he was only doing what God specifically told him to do in the first place. But you notice how Gideon handles it. He credits them and he discredits himself, and they go away feeling good about handling the mop up. Oh yeah, we did such a great job. And the truth of the situation doesn't change. Gideon is still the one who was instrumental in that victory, but he shows not only his ability to lead men, but also lead his emotions, which makes me think of Proverbs 16:32. He that is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he that ruleth his spirit than he that taketh a city. Gideon didn't need credit from men because he was getting credit from God. And part of that credit we read about in Hebrews 11, to be mentioned in the great chapter of faith. So then he chases down the fleeing Midianites, and he's refused help by two cities, Succoth and Penuel. And what happens is he asks for bread because he's chasing down the fleeing Midianites, and he's not asking for a lot, just bread that they can eat in verse 5 for Succoth and verse 8 for Penuel. And they both say no. And the reason is they say, well, are you, Zeb and Zalmunna, the two remaining kings of Midian they're chasing, he says they're not in your hand yet. So they're worried that the 15,000 guys that Zeb and Zalmunna have left are still more than the 300 that Gideon started with and still has. So they're not confident he's going to be able to finish the job, and so they won't help him because then they might face retaliation from Zeb and Zalmunna. So Gideon, instead of taking action then when he's probably pretty angry, so he can continue his work, he just warns them. He warns them and then leaves to continue his work. And goes to both places. He does the same thing. He tells them when that there's going to be a price to pay, and goes off. So, just like God, he gives them a warning, then there's a space for repentance, and then it's time to pay the piper. So they don't turn, and they could have, because we see a similar situation in David's life. When he goes up to Nabal and asks for food, and he's refused food, and he's going to go kill all of Nabal's household, but then Abigail comes running back with food and helps out the army, and then he's ends up marrying her after Nabal dies a little bit later, but he was about to go wipe him out. And so during the same space of repentance where there's a request for necessary food, they're refused, Abigail fixes it, Succoth and Penuel do not. And so what happens? Gideon catches and destroys Zeb and Zalmunna, and he goes back to those cities that refused him help. And he punishes them for hindering a God-ordained work. They were also cities of Israel, too. Well, not Israel. So Gad, I don't know the story of Penuel, but Succoth was part of the tribe of Gad, or in the land of the tribe of Gad, which we can read about in Joshua 13:27. It actually says that it was part of their inheritance. So you would think that Succoth would be willing to help a man of Israel fighting against the enemies of Israel, but they're so afraid of the enemies that they don't help. And again, he wasn't asking for a lot, just food so that he could keep going to stop their enemies. But they don't turn, and he catches Zeb and Zalmunna and he kills them. Actually, he brings them back to those two cities, and it says in verse 15 of chapter 8, and he came to the men of Succoth and said, Behold, Zeb and Zalmunna, with whom ye did upbraid me, saying, Are the hands of Zeb and Zalmunna now in thine hand, that we should give bread unto thy men that are weary? And he took he took the elders of the city, and thorns of the wilderness, and briars, and with them he taught the men of Succoth. So That's sometimes how it feels when we are reprimanded by, a man of God or a passage of the Bible that we need to correct. It can feel like thorns and briars, but it's still better than what happens to... So he said to the men... let me go back here. I'm sorry, I lost my place. Yeah, so then he teaches the men of Succoth and then goes back to Penuel and destroys their tower and kills the men there. So, a couple things. Try to advance the work of God when you know that there is a work of God. And in this case, they didn't. They looked with their eyes and saw that Gideon had fewer men than their enemies and decided not to help. So don't be like that. Try to help. And then the second thing is, listen to God-appointed leadership or expect thorns and briars. And, in this case, they literally got thorns and briars, and they literally got taught by there's something I'm looking for, and I just don't see it. I'm sorry. Okay, so anyway, that said, there was a quote I was looking for about how people who won't be taught by the Word will be taught by thorns, and that's basically what happened here. They didn't listen to Gideon, a man of working God's work, when he came and asked for help. They refused, and so then they have to learn the hard way. And that's just the way a lot of people have to learn, and you could save yourself a lot of effort if you didn't learn that way. So lastly, there's a couple things. Gideon is asked to be made king, and then he makes an ephod, so we're just about done here. But let me get it. So he kills Zebah and Zalmunna. It turns out that they had killed some of his relatives back a few chapters. But in verse 22, he says, Then the men of Israel said unto Gideon, Rule thou over us, both thou and thy son's son also, for thou hast delivered us from the hand of Midian. So they still don't give credit to God, even though God specifically used 300 men just to show there's no way it could have been by man. And they choose the instrument over the power behind the instrument and try to make Gideon a king. But notice how Gideon answers. In verse 23, I will not rule over you, neither shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. Which is really admirable. They already did have leadership in Israel. They didn't need a king. They had one already. I think J.R.R. Tolkien said, the most improper job of any man, even saints, is bossing other men. Not one in a million is fit for it, and least of all those who seek the opportunity. And Douglas Adams, who is a guy, he wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and a bunch of other books. He was talking about leadership, and he said it's a well-known fact that it's a well-known fact that those people who want to rule people are ipso facto those least suited to do it. To summarize, anyone who is capable of getting themselves made president should on no account be allowed to do the job. So they want a king instead of the king they had, which was God. And even though God just delivered them, they failed to recognize what He's done, and instead choose the instrument instead of the power. And then He makes an ephod with the gold that they took off of all the camels and the earrings. And it says that in 27, and Gideon made an ephod thereof with the gold and put it in his city, even in Ophrah, and all Israel went thither a-whoring after it, which thing became a snare unto Gideon and his house. Gideon did have privilege to do a few things that most people were not allowed to do. Sacrifice in an unusual form. He did have a lot of privilege, but it doesn't mean he could do whatever he want. It wasn't exactly a carte blanche. And we see it causes a lot of problems for others. Nadab and Abihu, they decided to offer strange fire and died for it. Cain decided to offer how he felt, and it didn't work out. And maybe Gideon thought it was okay because of all the other blessings he got, but he didn't have license to do this, and it ended up being another problem. So what I learned from that is, even if you are blessed to do things that maybe most aren't or have special gifts, always keep them inside the boundaries that God has ordained. And don't go reaching for more. Be thankful for what you've got and use it how God intended. So then he dies, and Israel, the sad story right here, and I can't... Oh, well, he has a bunch of kids first. In verse 30, and Gideon had 70 sons, for he had many wives. And then in verse 32, and Gideon, the son of Joash, died in a good old age and was buried. And in the next verse, and it came to pass, as soon as Gideon was dead, that the children of Israel turned again and went a-whoring after Balaam, and made Baal-Berith their god. And the children of Israel remembered not the Lord their God, who had delivered them out of the hands of their enemies on every side. So do remember what God did for you. I mean, they go right back, even though they had so much done for them, they just forgot it was more fun to go this way. They don't remember. But still, he brought years of peace during his life. And there it is, verse 28. And the country was in quietness 40 years in the days of Gideon. So all his work wasn't for nothing. The land did enjoy peace, but sadly, Israel, they didn't remember, and they went back into the same things. And if you remember, right at the very beginning, the first thing that happens, they're in trouble, they call to God, he sends them a prophet. The prophet says, look at what he's already done for you. They didn't remember then, they don't remember again. And so it's a sad lesson that hopefully we can learn from and not repeat over and over and over again. So there's a reward for doing the right thing. In this case, he was named. He's listed as a hero of faith. He lived in peace the rest of his days. And there's a price for doing the wrong thing, even if you can't always see it now. So that's it. Thank you for your attention, and I hope it was worth your time.